So today we're delighted to be joined by the very wonderful Miss Chris O'Dell. Chris, hello.
Hello there. How are you guys?
We're well. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. It's good to see you. I guess we lost Henry for a second again.
Yeah, Henry will come back in and out. I'm sure he'll drift in and out. He's on a very poor
Okay,
connection, but we're on a very strong connection. So a tight
okay.
connection to your heart, as Dylan would say.
That's what I'm looking for.
So, what are your earliest memories of joining Apple? It must have been quite daunting as a 20-year-old, I think, or 19, leaving
I think
everything
I,
behind.
I think I was 20, and today I even stop and think about it, and I think, what in the world gave me the courage to do that? And I think it was naivete and youth. Both being the same thing in a way. But when Derek said, come over, I was like, I mean, first of all, the magic started meeting Derek Taylor. That's the reality of all the, of all the people in LA, he was one of the few people I actually met. And when he first started saying, come over, I thought that was ridiculous because, back in 1968, people didn't just jump on planes and fly to continents at that time. So that was really beyond even my imagination. But I lived with a girl who was an aspiring actress called Terry Garr. And she said, had been to England, and she said, oh, you've got to go. So Derek called me from New York. He was with Paul and John when they were announcing the opening of Apple. And he called me during that trip and said, come over. And Terry said, you got to go. So I sold my record collection
Oh,
and my life insurance policy that my dad had taken out on me. And off I went. And my parents were great. They helped me out. And I can't imagine it now, but they were really supportive. So I flew to London. So, I mean, I let Derek know I was coming, but I arrived on a Saturday and he was not at Apple. There was nobody there. So I had to kind of make my way for 2 days until Apple opened to meet up with Derek. So it was quite an adventure. Just that piece was an adventure. Being on my own there for the first couple of days was weird, but good.
and who was the first Beatle that you met?
Paul. I was in Derek's office that first day, and he said, oh, I hear Paul next door. And I was a Beatle fan. So I'm like going, Paul's next door, you know? And I thought, oh, and I could kind of hear his voice. And I went, oh my God, this is like a wall. We have a wall between us. And then Derek came back. He went over to talk to Paul, came back in the room and said, and was bringing someone with him. So I totally expected to see Paul McCartney at that point, which made me extremely nervous. And it wasn't, it was Neil Aspinall. And then right after that, Paul came in. So he was literally the first Beatle I met. And then when I left Derek's office at one point, so that they could talk, in the hallway were John and Yoko. So I didn't actually meet them at that very second, but I did that day. So 2 Beatles in one day, first day at Apple. That's not bad. But that was what it was like. It was an office with Beatles.
And then it just became an everyday occurrence for you.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But because you got used to, after a while, you got to get used to it. You can't, I mean, the better part was maybe 2 days later, Derek said, because Derek put me with Richard DeLello. He had to get me doing something because nobody really had a job for me, but he did it in Derek Taylor's style. So he put me in a room with Richard DeLello, and we pasted press clippings into into these albums. And that was kind of my first job there, was helping. I didn't get paid, but I was helping Richard. And then I think the third day he said, would you like to go to lunch? Derek said, and I said, sure. But I didn't realize we were going to lunch with George. and that it was also going to the place where the opening of the men's boutique, Apple Boutique on Kings Road, was going to be happening. I just thought I was going to lunch with Derek. So when I went to Derek's office, George strolled in and we met, and then we got in his car and I sat in the back seat thinking, God, this is pretty amazing. And the one thing about George that I saw that first time is he always smelled of sandalwood. It like floated around him. In fact, when I went to see the thing at the Cirque du Soleil thing on the Beatles, they actually had that same incense wafting in the room. You know, you could just smell it. But he always smelled like that. For years, I have been wanting to ask Pattie, how did he do that? How did he get his clothes? Everything. It was just saturated, but it was good. So I just sat in the back seat, kind of spacing out on sandalwood. And we had lunch. He was very pleasant. He was very pleasant.
And George asked you to type up the lyrics for All Things Must Pass. What was it like reading those words for the first time? Could you imagine what the music would have been like?
Well, you know, I didn't pay any attention to it. It was a job. I just sat the paper. He would put an envelope or a scrap of paper or something next to me because I was set up in the old kitchen, which was a huge, big room. And he just put it there and I just type. I didn't think about what I was typing. I just typed. So, but I would hear him singing some of these songs in the house. So that's how I got to know them. But I don't think I really paid. I was so excited as were Terry and Pattie and everyone around him that George was going to finally do his own album. That is the highest memory I have of that time, is just this enthusiasm that he was going to move forward, because he was kind of he was depressed, kind of down during that period of time.
In Peter Jackson's Get Back, you can see John and Yoko egging on George to do that, to release an album full of his own songs. So that must have been quite special for him.
I think so. Well, you know, the day that Paul put the interview came out that Paul did saying that he was done, he quit the Beatles. John came over to the house that day, and he and George went out alone. And as I've said many times, it's the first time I ever saw John without Yoko. You want me to say more?
I was just waiting for one of my friends to ask a question.
Okay.
Okay.
Chris, I've been...
I know on that day that John came over to the house, but you said you didn't have any sense of what they discussed when they went out in the garden that day?
No. No, not at all. I mean, it was pretty apparent that George was, I don't know, I mean, I'm not even sure of the right word. I think I always figured it was because they had no forewarning, and that it was put out in such a way that he would just do it through a newspaper interview, as opposed to calling each of them and saying, I'm quitting. But they didn't, as far as I knew, it was a complete surprise. So imagine that you find out that, you know, it's all over. And I don't think it was that daunting to them that it was all over. It was just the shock of it and the realization that this is it.
Hey, Chris, I've been rereading that wonderful book by Richard DeLalo, The Longest Cocktail Party. And there's a funny bit in it. So Chris O'Dell walked into the room, submitted a petty cash claim for a 15-shilling taxi, and then wandered off to get another Scotch and Coke.
You know, funnily enough, Richard just emailed me as we were talking. That's so fun. Yeah, we still stay in touch. Yeah, that was kind of normal. It probably wasn't at the beginning of the day, though. It more than likely was at the latter part of the day.
Now, was his official title The House Hippie, or did he have a proper title?
You know, I don't know. I was told he got his his working papers, I think, as somebody who had come from America, knew the American music. So that would have been like a consultant. But in terms of officially, we always said he was the house hippie. And they said that's what they put on his paperwork, but I don't believe it.
Were you there for the famous Christmas celebration at 3 Savile Row with the Hells Angels?
Yes, I was indeed. Well, I got along with the Hells Angels because I just said, I'm American. And that was okay for them. So I just, I took away, I wasn't afraid of them. I was curious, but they didn't scare me. But we had been made to feel it was going to be scary. So I ended up hanging out with them a lot. And that night was a shocker, though, because they had to have been totally out of it. I mean, there were only two Hells Angels were all there. They came over with Ken Kesey, the writer, a girl named Frankie Hart, who later was with Bobby Weir, and the Grateful Dead road manager. I mean, they came as a group. That was the group, but there were only two Hells Angels. It always sounded like there were mobs of them. And Sweet William and Frisco Pete. And Sweet William was kind of he was a little frightening looking. He was a big guy with this big beard and leather jacket and everything. But, I hung out with them. I mean, I did acid with them once, and Sweet William took me for a ride on his motorbike, which was kind of scary, to be honest. But, you got to be ready for anything.
That must have been scary, even without the acid, I would imagine.
Well, it was because it was snowing, and we were on the west side of town, and he went to do a little turn, and the motorcycle skidded. And I thought, I'm dead. I'm going to die with a Hells Angel. But he kept it under control, so that was good.
And were you present when George very politely asked them that they could do better if they vacated the building promptly?
Well, it was agreed that they would be better to go off to Czechoslovakia and help with their problems rather than stay in London. Yeah, it took a long time, though. They were there for a while. It seemed like forever, but back then everything seemed forever, like it went on forever. The night of the Christmas party, I was standing right there when one of them socked the reporter in the face. It was not pleasant.
Where was Mal Evans when all this was going on?
I don't know, but he wasn't standing next to me. I know that for sure. But, as I'm reading Mal Evans' book, I'm realizing he wasn't really a fighter. He was just big. But he avoided fights when he could.
The impression I have of him is a big cuddly bear from watching Get Back, rather than a man monster.
Great sense of humor, always happy, or, mostly always happy, and protecting. He was the gate. You had to get through him to get to the Beatles for anyone, outside of people who knew him, knew them.
You managed to sneak past Mal via Pete Shotton to get into the White Album sessions. Did Mal hold a grudge after that?
Oh no, maybe he respected me for having wormed my way in. I don't know. No, we stayed friends. Really, pretty much up until the end. I saw him not that many days before he actually, or months, maybe it was a matter of months before he was shot. But no, I don't think so. I mean, I said, can I come to a session? Or I asked Paul, could I come to one of your sessions? Because they just started recording. And I thought I couldn't see a problem with that. I was there, I was at Apple. And he said, oh, sure, talk to Mal. That was the key right there. So I talked to Mal, and Mal said, oh, yeah, you can come over this evening. Why don't you go with me? We'll go pick up some instruments for tonight's session. So I felt I was in the door. And then when later that evening, I went over to Abbey Road, the the guard called him out, and he and I sat and talked in the reception area for a long time. And suddenly I went, he's not going to let me in. He's just going to talk to me. And then Peter Shotton came up, John's friend, and we started talking. And then Pete said, Mal left. And Pete said, you want to go into the studio? So we did. So we went down through a side door down right directly into the studio, into Studio 2.
Which song were they recording?
Well, I'm pretty sure it was Revolution number 9, because we ended up clapping on it. Imagine, I got in, I snuck in, and then I got to clap on it. And yeah, I'm pretty sure. I've never looked at the date, but other people have said, oh yeah, that was Revolution number 9. So I just assume it was. I never heard the music. Well, I must have.
And so
because
Paul would not have been there that day.
I remember John, Yoko, and Ringo, I think, was there. I think. But I don't remember. I don't remember Paul being there.
I think he was in New York, wasn't he?
Actually, no, because he was at Apple that day. So I think he might have been there, because it was just the very beginning of recording. So I think Paul was there.
Okay.
From what I read, though, he was a bit annoyed that he wasn't involved in the recording of Revolution 9, because he would like to have been involved in that sort of avant-garde music that he sort of was a big fan of at the time. So he was a bit disappointed, is what I've read. But
yeah, a lot of that album they would do. I spent the evening there with George once when he was doing Savoy Truffle, and he was the only one there. So there was a lot of alone time during that period. But I also would go there and they'd all be there. So it was kind of mixed bag.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, Chris, you sure you didn't mean Revolution 1 with the hand claps? Because I can think of hand claps on Revolution 1, not on Revolution 9.
Perfect. I'll take that one. Yeah. Okay. I'll correct myself.
That fits perfectly, because they were all involved on that one.
Well, I thought that Revolution number 9, I thought hand claps, that's weird. But, I have the memory. I don't really care about the accuracy.
You are immortalized on vinyl. Don't worry, Chris.
Oh, thank you.
And did you detect much tension among the group in those days, Chris?
I was too new to and naive to the scene to have detected any tension. I mean, during the time I was there came a time when it was fairly apparent, because, you'd hear about it, especially when they were at Twickenham. People would come back and you'd hear, oh, it's not going so good. George just quit the band. But in fact, I always heard, and I've never heard it repeated, so maybe it wasn't real, but I like it. George, the story was that George said, if you wanted to quit the band, how would you do it? And Paul said, well, you just leave. And so George said, goodbye, and walked out the door. That's a version I had heard way back then that stuck in my head. And I liked that version. So, and then of course, as time went by, the tension at Apple became more and more, because, it went through a phase where everything was so cool and it was great. And then they started realizing too many people were spending too much money on minicabs, and there was too much alcohol being served in the press office. And that was Paul. He had a meeting with all of us and said, we need to cut down on all of this spending. So that was the first sign I remember. Because at one point, Paul walked up to my office and he was looking at the bathroom on our floor, and he said, do you think we should put in paper towels or cloth towels? So at that point, he wasn't thinking save money. But I think as more and more people took advantage of it, although it didn't feel like we were taking advantage, And then when the Klein stuff happened, there was no doubt there was a problem. And eventually Paul didn't come anymore.
Yeah.
And what do you think of Alan Klein? Did you get to meet him much, or you avoided him?
Well, I saw him obviously at Apple. And then when I went to live at Friar Park with George and Pattie, he came out once or twice, once with Phil Spector, So I knew him on a little bit of a looser level where he seemed okay. But, you know, back then we were holding on tight to what we had. It was like, it was just this wonderful thing. Everybody was happy and we were having fun and all these amazing things. Every day, something exciting happened. It just, you couldn't help something. Even a beetle walking in was exciting. That would travel from the ground floor to the first floor or the fourth floor in no time. Um, and that was what was being threatened, was that was going to end. And that was really hard for all of us who had been enjoying that, because what it was is it was exactly what they had hoped to put together, a group of people, all young people, very into music, trying to help everybody and get everything done. They just didn't have the financial people to oversee it. So I went to George and Pattie's and stayed there for a while. And when I came back to Apple, George called me up and said, he called Richard. I was sitting with Richard DeLello, and Richard said, yes, she's here. And he gave me the phone, and George said, you're going to get fired, but don't worry. It's the best thing that could happen. And I thought, okay, coming from George, I can accept this. Thank God he did that, or I would have been really upset. But I waited for another month or at least or two before they fired me. And I had to wait because I was going to get severance.
Yeah.
What was your next move after that?
Well, let me think. What did I do? Oh, I went to work for Derek and the Dominoes.
Yeah.
But prior to that, I'd also gone back to America with Leon Russell and come back to Apple. And Alan Klein didn't want to rehire me then. So that's why I ended up at George's house.
It must have been quite an awesome place to stay. I mean, there was over 100 rooms in that property, and there were 4 or 5 of you staying there at the time?
Kevin Harrington was there. Terry Doran was there. Yeah, myself and Patty and George, and no furniture and no heating. The only heating were little gas heaters. And the first night, Terry just gave me a sleeping bag, said, pick any room you want. And I ventured not very far from the main hall because that's all I knew. So, but eventually we found cots in the garden shed. And so I was sleeping on cots. Patty and George were on a mattress. And then eventually they got beds, but not for a very long time. I mean, there was nothing there.
How long were you there for?
You know, again, it's one of those weird things where it seems like forever, but it was probably 3 or 4 months.
Right. I seem to remember, Chris, in your book, you told the story of a party, I think it was at Friar Park, where all 4 Beatles came in 1970. And there's been some discussion as to whether that was true or not. Do you remember that? How well do you remember that?
No, I think it wasn't true. I think it was, my memory was off on that. Because that Paul wouldn't have been invited, number one. And I actually have talked to Patty about this, and Ringo was definitely there. And I think he may have been the only other Beatle that was there besides George. There were a lot of other people like Peter Frampton and people like that, the musicians that were around, but it wasn't the 4 of them. That was my fantasy.
Did Ringo visit a lot during that time when you were staying at Friar Park?
No, that was the only time I ever saw him there.
But there was another occasion when you were all sitting around the kitchen table when George said, Ringo, I'm in love with your wife. You were present at that discussion.
Yeah.
How did that play out?
Well, I don't talk about that anymore because I wrote it and I figured that was enough. And you know, it was inside info, and I mean, it had been written about before I wrote about it. I don't think there was only one thing I wrote about concerning that group of people that hadn't been written before, and that was about my time with Ringo, which was about a minute. And so I kind of think if I had to do it again, I probably wouldn't have included all that, but it was a part of the story for me. It was pretty tricky, let me tell you. You know, it was tricky. It was not a nice time. But I have to keep reminding people that we were in our 20s and they had just, their whole lives were changing. There were a lot of drugs around in the 70s. And, you know, if you really look at what was going on around that period of time, it wasn't so shocking. Plus, to realize that there weren't that many people outside of the group. So they stuck very, very much in the inside circle. And it was almost a natural way to move to one of the other people inside that circle. Sounds crazy, but it's true at that point.
Yeah.
So
I think that was a very honest admission you just made, and I think that's so true of you, Chris. I think the thing is that you inspired so much trust with all the Beatles, and they all kept in touch with you, and they all looked after you in a way that they didn't manage to keep in touch with each other in the 70s.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, you had a special relationship, I feel.
Yeah, I think I had a good relationship, and in some ways that's why I look now after I figured when I wrote my book, how many years later was it? I thought, what can we possibly, any of us, it's just memory. But now I wish in a way that I had left some of that out, because I was an insider, but also get my story. I have my story. So there you go.
Sure.
You also tell a great story of when John, May, and Ringo were gathered together at the Plaza Hotel in New York, reminiscing about the first time they came to the States and stayed in the same hotel. How did that conversation go?
That was so cool. Well, that was George's tour, and I picked up John and May in a car and took them to George's concert. And afterwards, we all came back to the Plaza. In the meantime, Maureen was coming over to New York to hang out with me. So she happened to arrive after the concert and was in my room, which was right next to the hospitality room. And so I went over and I said to George and John, Maureen's here. And, at the time, it never occurred to me everything that had been going on and that it might be awkward. It was outside of my head. And so the two of them came over and the four of us just sat around in my room, and they did a lot of reminiscing. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I remember the first time they came to America and they were staying at the Plaza Hotel. How could I have known that one day half of them would be standing in my room at the Plaza Hotel, talking about old times and catching up. But it was actually really nice. It was good for Maureen to have had that experience.
Must have been a very different stay from the first one, when they were the whole hotel was besieged. The streets surrounding it were clogged with fans. What was it like when you were staying there?
It wasn't like that at all.
So they could move relatively freely in those days.
Yeah, totally different. I went to Disneyland with both George and Ringo at separate times when they were in LA. The time I went with George, Patty wasn't there, and we went with Mal, and somebody came up to George and said, "What's your name?" "I know who you are. What's your name?" And he said, "Denny Lane." And they walked away and didn't say anymore. And both of them kind of got, in those two different times, they certainly, people came up and wanted to talk to them and wanted to get their autographs and everything. But it was polite. It wasn't, like, sorry, excuse me, but.
Well, there were no smartphones in those days, so it was very different.
Oh, for real. Definitely.
But going back to the Dark Horse tour and Madison Square Gardens, I believe Paul and Linda were present that night in a disguise, and it was your job to invite them backstage.
Yes, that was another mistake of mine. I should have known better. I knew them well enough, and I was depending on someone who didn't know them to tell me to go get them. And, if you think about it, they weren't, this is sort of during the times they were signing contracts to get out of the Beatles, and there were a lot of lawsuits. But yeah, Barry Emhoff, who worked with Bill Graham, said, "Go get Paul. He's in," and he gave me the seat numbers, and I should have right then said, "No, I'm not going to. You go get him." So, but I didn't. I made my way down. I walked between the rows, got right behind them, and they were. I wouldn't have recognized them at that point. And I went, "Hi, it's Chris," and they went, "Go away, go away. We don't want them to know who we are." And I'm like, "Okay." And I'm staying there with my backstage ID on and everything. And they didn't come backstage, but they did come to the party afterwards.
I've seen the photographs of their disguise. It seemed very crude. Did nobody spot that they were Paul and Linda?
You know, they seem to like to get dressed up a lot doing that. I think he did a lot of disguise stuff in the time that during those years. You know, I knew it was them, but if you weren't expecting them, you probably wouldn't have paid any attention. I mean, do you normally look at people around you and study them who are sitting in a concert? Not really. Although I have no idea what happened after I left.
Were you at the after show party as well?
I was. Yeah.
And Paul and Linda were also present, you said. So
they were there. No, it was never mentioned again. Yeah. It's one of those things, you just let it go.
So George and Paul were getting on okay that night, from what you could see, or?
Well, you know, as I recall, it was okay. It was all John was, and May were there. It was just, you know, they were kind of over here and I was partying over here. So, you know, it seemed to be okay. Paul did not come back. He never came to the plaza or anything. In fact, May Pang has the last picture ever taken of them together, and that was actually in Santa Monica before all this happened. So they were speaking that Paul had come to Santa Monica to see him.
Yeah, there's another picture in Mal's book, isn't there? I think of the same day. March
I haven't gotten to that yet. Is there?
Yeah, I don't have the book, but I know I saw it was on the internet a few days ago. That from the same day in March '74, and May is in the picture. Linda, Harry Nilsson, John and Paul.
Oh, I may have seen that picture at some point.
Yeah.
But yeah, I remember the day. I was there that day. But yeah. I kind of I went away because there was a feeling at that point of, oh, Paul's coming. So yeah, I did download Mal's book, and I'll get a copy of it when I go to the Beatle Fest in February. And I hope that I can get one from Ken Womack or Gary Evans. Hi.
James. Hi.
Hi.
James.
Hi, Chris. Hi,
James.
everybody.
What's that? A whiskey?
No, it's a Kopparberg orange ginger beer, alcoholic.
Wow.
Good. We'll believe you. So, Chris, just going back to Apple days, and I heard you on another podcast saying that you felt that the three Beatles who supported Klein, they weren't necessarily mad about Klein, but they just didn't want to end up in hock to Paul's new extended family. Do you feel that was the big driver?
I think that John and Yoko really liked Klein.
Okay.
I think they really liked him. I think George and Ringo kind of went along with it but none of them were going to go to Lee Eastwood. That would have put Paul in charge completely, and that just wasn't going to happen.
Yeah.
But I think John and Yoko truly believed he was the right person for them, even though Mick Jagger tried to tell them not.
Yeah.
I think Alan Klein went to some lengths, didn't he, to endear himself to Yoko? That was my reading of the situation.
Absolutely. He was a very smart man. And you know, I was saying earlier that, you know, when he came into the picture, it was fairly apparent that all of us were going to be gone because he didn't want the same people around. But I realize now, years later, I say that always happens when someone comes in. They get rid of the people that are there and replace them with people they trust and know. So I don't, now I feel he was just doing what was probably the right thing to do for a business, from a business perspective. But back then it was like, he's killing everything we've got. It's wonderful.
Mm.
And what were your memories, Chris, of the Isle of Wight festival?
Which one? Oh, the Bob Dylan one?
Yeah.
I also saw Jimi Hendrix at the Isle of Wight. Well, the memories were pretty amazing, actually, because who expected to end up in a helicopter with a harmonica or a couple harmonicas and land in the backyard of the rented farm of Bob Dylan? And so we kind of went in, and George and Pattie were there, and they offered us breakfast, and they were all rehearsing in the barn. So we hung out there actually that first day, played tennis and did all kinds of weird things. And then the night of the concert, we went with George and Pattie to the concert, and it was just fun, because here we were in this special little area. Ringo and Maureen were there, and John and Yoko came, and it was like, God, look. And and Bill Oakes and I were only going to take a train and sit back with the rest of the people in the back like normal people. So it was kind of like, well, that didn't work. We didn't get to be normal. And then, of course, to top it off, John invited us to come on the charter plane right after the show to go back to London, which we did. And as I wrote my book, we got very high on pot, on hash, or whatever it was. And I was convinced, well, I think they were convinced it was going to crash too, because there were a lot of turbulence, and we were all chanting Hare Krishna. So I get the feeling it was going to be, yeah, we were all kind of like, oh God. But then I just thought, it's okay. I'll make the paper. John Lennon, Yoko, and 2 Apple employees killed in an airplane accident.
More immortality. How did they respond to Dylan's performance?
Oh, they loved him. They loved it. They loved Dylan.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, he was, as far as they were concerned, he was the one person better, more famous, more everything than them. That's who they looked up to.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly I know George did. I think they all did at different times, but yeah.
I was going to mention, do you think Paul shared in that, or was he slightly apart, do you think?
Well, Paul always was a little bit apart in life. I mean, that probably came out wrong. But he had like his own thing going over to the side, where I would see George, when I was, George and Ringo and John, I would see together a little bit more socially. But Paul was totally focused on Apple, making everything right, doing the next album, doing the next whatever. So, I don't think he was as influenced. The answer is, I don't think he was as influenced later at that period of time by Dylan as they were at the very beginning.
Yeah.
Was there any talk between them of collaborating with Dylan?
I never heard of any.
Yeah.
And if anyone would have, it would have been George.
Yeah, I think George is on record saying he wanted to invite Dylan into the Beatles and Billy Preston and everyone, and to have a kind of massive jam session.
Well, actually, in the end, he did have a band with Dylan.
He did.
Yeah. And you were at the concert for Bangladesh, Chris?
I was.
Memories of that evening for us, please?
Well, it was very exciting because George and Pattie were in LA that summer, or prior to that concert. And so George said to me, we're going to put this concert together. And I was all for it. So I helped make phone calls to different people. We used Leon Russell's office to get some of the background singers. And, you know, helped him get in touch with some musicians. But of course, no one was going to say no. So it wasn't like this huge deal. So, you know, there was a lot going on that summer about getting the Bangladesh concert together. So getting to New York and actually seeing it happening was like so great. And George, watching him get the glory.
Yeah.
You know, Patty and I stayed with them in their suite, and Patty and I went together to the evening show. And we were, I mean, it was just like, oh man, all we could do was watch George and just think, this is coming off so well. And he's going to be so happy. It really was an up for him. And I think that's what we were, at least she and I have both said that's what we were feeling at that time.
It must have been quite a big relief for George as well, because there were great concerns that both Dylan and Eric wouldn't turn up for the evening. So when they finally arrived, that must have been incredible.
There was a lot of that going out, especially around Eric getting on a flight. Dylan only had to come from downtown. But even the night before at the rehearsal, Al Aronowitz, who was a journalist in New York, he was there, and he was actually quite instrumental in getting Dylan to come. And I remember he and Patty and I were sitting there and saying, man, nobody knows if Bob's going to show up or not. So there was, when he walked in, there was this sigh of relief, because we didn't know if he was going to actually make the rehearsal or the show. But we figured if he made the rehearsal, he'd probably make the show.
I've read stories that Bob was very, very up and excited after the first performance and was just sort of running around saying, yeah, let's do that again every week. Do you have any memory of that? Of him just being like a...
What I have, I didn't go to the first show. Patty and I stayed back. I don't know why, but we did. Oh. And when George came back, he brought Bob with him. And they just were so elated. They were both so happy. They went into the living room and they were just talking about everything that happened. And yeah, he was definitely, it made for a really good nighttime concert.
I guess George would have been very nervous in the run up to that, because it was the first time, I think, wasn't it, that a Beatle had done a big solo show like that? It was a bit of a big step, wasn't it, really?
Well, it was the first charity concert that had ever happened with a group of musicians. So he went somewhere where no one had gone before. And he was very nervous about it. I think he was nervous even when he was on stage, to be honest, because there was just so much. There was Eric. We hoped he'd make it to 2 shows, and, you know.
And what do you recall about the after show party?
The after show party was so great. I danced with Andy Williams. Do you know who he is?
Oh, yes, we know who he is. Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
did he hit on you, Chris?
Huh?
Did he hit on you?
Twice. Not that night, another night later in LA. And I don't even think he knew I was the same. Well, he didn't know I was the same person. I think he hit on a lot of women. Anyway, I'm out there dancing thinking, I'm dancing with Andy Williams. There's something not right about this picture. I don't know what it is.
Not very rock and roll, is it?
No, yeah. I needed Billy Preston.
Yeah, he made the Osmonds famous, I think.
Who did? Oh, Andy Williams.
Andy,
yes, definitely, definitely. He was a very nice man. The few times he hit on me.
Would George have been the late great Billy Preston? What are your memories of Billy?
Oh my God. Well, for one thing, the highlight for me of that whole evening was when Billy got up and started dancing during one of his songs. And it was just because he got the audience, really. I mean, they were already there, but he pulled them in even tighter. Billy, I met when he first got to London that year that they were recording. And was it Let It Be? Yeah, Let It Be. Mm-hmm. And George had asked me to get in touch with him and get him to the studio. And his William Morris agency was in the building right next to Apple. And I knew his agent, so Larry Curzon, who was American. So I called Larry and he got the message to Billy, and Billy came to Apple, and the rest is history, basically. But we were very good friends for a long, long time. we stayed in touch. I loved Billy.
Well, when Billy walks into the studio at Savile Row in the film Get Back, the whole mood seems to change and everyone seems to lighten up. Did they all know that Billy was going to be dropping in that day?
George knew that he had been, that we'd gotten in touch with him, and we had a time that he was going to come to Apple and ask for me when he got to reception. So he may have mentioned it to them, I don't know, but he definitely knew Billy was coming.
I think the established law is that George brought Billy Preston in an attempt to try to calm some of the, the waters that had been a bit choppy. Did you get any insight into that, or did you have any conversations with George about that, this idea that he was going to come in and try and, be a peacemaker inadvertently?
No, I didn't get anything from George like that. What I got was when I told him Billy Preston was in London, he said, "Oh, great. I'd love to get together with him." Now, where he went with that, I have no idea.
Right.
Yeah.
And can we take you back to the rooftop, Chris, because you were one of only 5 or 6 people who were present. I know you covered it in your book, but if you were to write your book again, I think you should devote at least 3 chapters to that performance.
To the roof.
So what was it like? You were sitting with Yoko, I think, and a couple of others in the freezing cold.
Yes, I was sitting next to Ken Mansfield. Well, I was Tony Richmond, the cameraman. We were told that no employees were allowed on the roof, mostly because the roof was not sturdy. They were afraid it would fall in. They had things underneath it. I forget what you call those, not being a carpenter, to hold it up. And my office was right near the stairs to the roof. We used to go up, the girls used to go on the roof and sunbathe. I mean, that was when the sun came out, which wasn't that often. But anyway, so Tony Richmond came by my office and said, "Are you coming up?" And I said, "No, I'm not allowed." And he said, "You're coming with me." So he took me, "You're my assistant." Right. I know so much about cameras. So he took me and put me in that one seat, which was closest to the edge of the roof and right next to his camera. Then Ken Mansfield, who ran Apple in the States, he happened to be there at the time, and he came up. He was wearing the white coat. And then Maureen came, and then Yoko came after that. So the 4 of us got seats below the chimney. My whole focus that day was I wanted to see what the people were going to say on the streets. I was like thinking about, what is this going to be like? That suddenly all these pedestrians are going to hear the Beatles. I mean, that to me was like an event that I really wanted to witness. So I spent time looking over to see how many people were down there, probably as much as I did watching them. Because watching them, it didn't occur to me that it was actually, it was like watching them in the studio. I don't know. I just didn't get it. I didn't get it. I didn't get it that I was watching this important event at the moment. I thought it was a pretty amazing event, and I was happy to be a part of it. But I was also very worried that Peter Brown was going to come and tell me to get off the roof because I wasn't supposed to be up there. And then all the people start coming out of all the buildings around, windows opening, people coming out. And it was pretty amazing. But it was also extremely cold. And as much as you would think you would forget that, you didn't. It was just so cold up there. And the policeman came, and in a way I was kind of glad because it was so cold. So when he came, which we knew was probably going to happen, it wasn't a big surprise. It was just sitting watching them and seeing what they were going to do. And I kind of remember them coming and unplugging some amps. And I remember him unplugging George and George putting his back in again. Yep. I don't know if he did it to the others, but it wasn't like, "Oh my God, can you believe the cops are here?" No. What they said to Jimmy the doorman was, "Do you realize this is louder than a transistor radio?"
The building had structural issues. How precarious were those rickety old floorboards that they used on the roof?
Don't want to know the answer to that. But it wasn't that long afterwards that they actually tore the whole inside of the building, as far as I know. Once they moved out of there, it was all rebuilt again.
When did they
So-
put in the floorboards? Was it the day before the concert, or were they erected before that?
Hard to remember. You know, I think that was on a Monday, wasn't it? The concert, I think, might have been on a Monday. So there had to have been things. Well, I'll tell you what I do know. I don't know much about that. Was up there, that they didn't do it that morning. Let's put it that way. So that had to have gone up before, maybe over the weekend. But I do remember that it was hard getting. The big thing is how'd they get the equipment up there? You know, because the stairway had a turn in it, and then it wasn't a very large door. It was like a rooftop doorway. So that was a big question, is how in the heck did they get Billy's keyboard up there? You know, but they did. They managed it all. I heard some of them talking about Kevin Harrington. I did something with Kevin Harrington, and I can't remember the guy's name, but he was doing the sound, and they were talking about what it was like for them. And I thought, God, that's a whole nother side that I didn't even think about. Most people didn't think about what was going on. It was one thing to see it, but what about everything that had to happen for it to come together?
Yeah. I mean, I know you were concentrating on A, not falling off the roof, and B, not dying of frostbite, but you saw the Beatles' final performance, Chris. How did they come across as a group performing to a public, even if the public was way down below them?
Well, I do remember that, Henry. I do remember thinking, damn, they're good. They're really good. Because I'd seen them at Dodger Stadium in '66 or something, and they were like big, this big, and you couldn't hear them. But, you know, and I'd seen them in the studio, but actually watching them, you know, playing together, they were tight. It was amazing. Yeah.
I think it's a brilliant performance, that.
Yeah, it was.
What I find amazing about it is that how they just went downstairs afterwards and just carried on making the album. This is one of the great myths of the Beatles' history, is that they do this final show and then, you know, disappear, but they just went straight back to work, didn't they?
Well, that's exactly right. In fact, what I've always said is, it wasn't their. Everybody sees it as the last time they played together, but in fact, I know that they just went right back downstairs again and started playing. And they still continued recording in the studio after that. So it didn't seem like a last concert at all.
What happened is they did the acoustic songs the next day on the Friday. The concert was on the Thursday, and then they did.
Oh, was it Thursday?
Yeah. Two of Us, Let It Be, and Long Winding Road on the Friday, and then they packed up and got back to do Abbey Road later, of course.
Did you see any of the Abbey Road sessions, Chris? Were you around when they were doing? Because they were doing late
in Savile Row
and Abbey Road as well.
I don't remember going to Abbey Road, but I do remember them still being in the studio at Apple. I mean, they were around a lot. Once the studios once they started using it, they were around Apple a lot.
Yeah.
There's in the Get Back book, there's a picture in Savile Row with Paul clean shaven, and I'm trying to figure out what the hell session it was, because most of Abbey Road, as you know, was done at Abbey Road. So I can't think it was. Maybe it was Old Brown Shoe, or any ideas, Colin or Chris? Can you remember?
Oh, you guys know much more than I do.
That's a real Beatles obsessive style question, that, isn't it? On what day did Paul shave off his beard? We need to know.
There are probably people who know that, amazingly.
Yeah, it's interesting to know when the construction work started on the roof, because in the movie Get Back, there's a great deal of discussion about what they're going to do for the final conclusion of the movie, and at what stage did they discuss going on the roof isn't immediately apparent. So if they start constructing a few days before that or a week before that, that'd be quite interesting to work out what their thought process was.
I think actually that confused me a little bit when I saw Get Back and the discussion they had in the timeline. I think that confused my memory, because I do, if I really like let that go, I remember that they were already putting up stuff to hold up the roof on the 4th floor, which is the one I was on, a couple days before that. That stuff was already going on. But I mean, I remember them talking about doing the Grand Canyon. I thought, wow, that'd be cool. I'm going back to Arizona to watch that one. So there were a lot of discussions.
Were you asked to investigate any of those other options, like playing on a cruise ship or in Tripoli or Grand Canyon?
No.
So you just heard them on the grapevine?
Oh, you heard everything when you were at Apple. You know, there weren't a lot of secrets.
I think George was quite dismissive of quite a lot of those ideas, wasn't he? Isn't there a quote from him where he says something like, I'm not fucking going to wherever it was. One of the suggestions, he was quite clear about it, wasn't he? He didn't want to do it. And that's really why they ended up on the roof, I think, probably because there was, they couldn't agree, or they couldn't get George to agree to go anywhere.
I think George wasn't excited being sort of locked onto a cruise ship with 2,000 Beatles fans for however long it took to get over to North Africa and back. So you can understand that.
He was so done by then. I don't think even going on the roof was fun. I think even that he hated. So yeah, he was just done with all of that stuff. He had, and from my own opinion, he had found Friar Park. He got into gardening. He started to find the things he really liked. He got into spirituality. The Krishnas were living there. There was a temple in the living room. They would go around and they were, with the little bags, prayer bags, and chanting Hare Krishna all day. It was such a different, his head was in such a different place at that time. I think he was really done. Like, I don't want to do this anymore.
After the success of Bangladesh, why do you think George went back and did the Dark Horse tour?
Because he had been so successful with the Bangladesh concert. I think he thought, and the people around him felt, that it would be an enjoyable experience. And he was feeling, he was out front for the first time. He was finally getting, recognition and everything. So I think he thought it would be good. He'd get good musicians together and he'd had fun on Bangladesh. I think he thought that's what the tour was going to be.
Unfortunately, his voice was shot through by the end of the tour. How depressed was he by that whole experience?
Yeah, he became more and more isolated in a way, like staying kind of off to himself. And Olivia was there by that period of time, so he kind of hung out mostly with her towards the end. At the beginning of the tour, he was all up for it and everything, but yeah, it was not what he had hoped it to be.
Yeah, and that was your breakthrough as a tour manager, wasn't it, Chris?
Actually, no. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young were prior to that. Yeah.
Okay. And what was the Dark Horse tour like? I heard that you were happy with the 3 different kitchen units you had.
Love those kitchen units. Well, we had Indian food all the time. Yeah, they put one backstage, one at Ravi's hotel, and one at George's hotel. So we had Indian food there all the time, which was made George happy. It was, I thought it was a great tour. I loved it because I loved all the Indian musicians. They were so nice and so overwhelmed. There was one guy who had to go back to India for something. And he said, "Shall I give your wife a message?" And he said, "Yeah, tell her I'm not coming home." They were like, oh, they loved it. So I thought they were very cool, and I liked being with them. And they had a great band, and it had its. I mean, we had some interesting moments when we were in D.C. and they went to the White House. We were staying at the Watergate Hotel. I mean, there were some interesting moments and different people popping in, but it certainly was apparent that he wasn't going to be doing that again. That was it.
Do you think in retrospect that George maybe should have played it a bit differently in terms of, agreeing to do more Beatles songs and maybe not changing the lyrics to some of the songs that he was famous for. He seemed really hell-bent, didn't he, on not playing the Beatles card on that tour, and really not wanting to play the game, because the promoters wanted him to, I think, didn't they? That's my understanding. They kind of wanted it to be George Harrison Beatle, but he was really not on for that.
That's right. And that's George. That was George. He was stubborn. And, you know, if he wanted to do it his way, he's going to do it his way. He didn't care about whether it was going to make the concert better or not. He just didn't care.
And when was the last time you... Sorry.
I was just going to say, honestly, thinking of taking Ravi Shankar and his group as your opening act, that in itself is pretty blatant.
Yeah, I was just thinking, Chris, because if I compare, I saw George at the Albert Hall in 1992, and he was superb. And I listened to bootlegs of '74, and it's pretty dire, I have to say. I don't know if it's just because it's bootleg quality, and his voice is obviously shot. His version of "In My Life" is an embarrassment. I don't know what Lennon would have thought of it.
Well, I mean, he wasn't prepared to. He just wasn't prepared to do that long a tour. I think that was the big problem. Had they done a shorter tour? I mean, it was what, 3 weeks, 3 weeks probably. That was about normal. That was a long tour for somebody who wasn't used to it, to be singing all the time. I mean, it's a long tour for someone who sings all the time.
Yeah.
Really, you know, controls their voice. So. Yeah, it was not a happy ending for him.
So he wasn't prepared for it, really. I guess in the Beatles, they were performing, 20 minutes in the States, and he was doing one song and backup vocals, so he didn't need to look after his voice. But how long was the set on that Dark Horse tour? Was it an hour and a half with it?
I don't remember. I honestly don't remember, because, to be honest, those were the only times I got to relax. So I went backstage and had a drink, and I would only go out and watch certain songs that I really loved on every tour that I did. So, I don't know how long it was, to be honest.
And what was the response from the audience when you went out there? How were they receiving George?
Well, they were excited to see him, but they also had just got through. And the majority of places that we went, people weren't ready for that. They could, remember Robbie said in the Bangladesh, was it Bangladesh or it was in New York, when he was just warming up and they applauded him. He said, well, if you like that so much, will you hear our music? I mean, people just didn't have any consciousness of that. So by the time George came out, there was a feeling of finally, and he did sound pretty bad when he couldn't sing anymore. So, it was a disappointment in many ways.
When was the last occasion you spoke to George?
I think it would have been in the 90s. When did he pass? I can't remember.
2001.
2001, yeah.
Okay, so it was in the 90s, and I went to London. I was in London with my ex-husband at that time, and my son, and Ringo was there and doing concerts. So we went to Ringo's concert, and then afterwards they had a birthday party at the Dorchester Hotel for Ringo, and George was there. And I talked to him that was the last time that I remember really talking to him, because then I moved back to the States, so I didn't have much opportunity. And
Chris,
my relationship with Pattie had been a huge piece of us keeping connected.